Chapter 23. In the weeks following his final encounter with the three bullies, Horace noticed a definite change in life at the battle school. The most important factor in the change was that Alda, Bryn, and Jerome were all expelled from the school and from the castle in its neighboring village. Sir Rodney had been suspicious for some time that there had been a problem among the ranks of his junior students. A quiet visit from Halt alerted him as to where it lay, and the resultant investigation soon brought to light the full story of the way Horace had been victimized. Sir Rodney's judgment was swift and uncompromising. The 3 second-year students were given a half-day to prepare and pack. They were supplied with a small amount of money and a week's supplies, and were transported to the Fife's boundaries, where they were told, in no uncertain terms, not to return. Once they were gone, Horace's lot improved considerably. The daily routine of the battle school was still harsh and challenging as ever, but without the added burden that Alda, Bryn, and Jerome had laid upon him, Horace found he could easily cope with the drills, the discipline, and the studies. He rapidly began to achieve the potential that Sir Rodney had seen in him. In addition, his roommates, without the fear of incurring the bully's vengeance, began to be more welcoming and friendly. In short, Horace felt that things were definitely looking up. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to thank Halt properly for the improvement in his life. After the events in the meadow, Horace had been placed in the infirmary for several days while his bruises and contusions were attended to. By the time he was released, he found that Halt and Will had already left for the Rangers' gathering. "Are we nearly there?" Will asked, for perhaps the 10th time that morning. Halt gave vent to a small sigh of exasperation. Other than that, he made no reply. They had been on the road now for 3 days, and it seemed to Will that they must be close to the gathering ground. Several times in the past hour he had noticed an unfamiliar scent on the air. He mentioned it to Halt, who said briefly, "It's salt. We're getting close to the sea," then refused to elaborate any further. Will glanced sidelong at his teacher, hoping that perhaps Halt might deign to share a little more information with him, but the ranger's keen eyes were scanning the ground in front of them. From time to time, Will noticed, he looked up into the trees that flanked the road. "Are you looking for something?" Will asked, and Halt turned in his saddle. "Finally, a useful question," he said. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. The chief ranger will have sentries out around the gathering ground. I always like to try to fool them as I'm approaching." "Why?" asked Will, and Halt allowed himself a tight little grin. "It keeps them on their toes," he explained. "They'll try to slip behind us and follow us in, just to say that they've ambushed me. It's a silly game they like to play." "Why is it silly?" asked Will. It sounded exactly like the sort of skill exercises that he and Halt practiced regularly. The grizzled ranger turned in his saddle and fixed Will with an unblinking stare. "Because they never succeed," he said. "And this year they'll be trying even harder because they know I'm bringing an apprentice. They'll want to see how good you are." "Is this part of the testing?" Will asked, and Halt nodded. "It's the start of it. Do you remember what I told you last night?" Will nodded. For the past 2 nights around the campfire, Halt's soft voice had given Will advice and instructions on how to conduct himself at the gathering. Last night they devised tactics for the use in case of ambush, just the sort of thing that Halt had mentioned now. "When will we—" he began, but suddenly Halt was alert. He held up a warning finger for silence, and Will stopped speaking instantly. The ranger's head was turned slightly to listen. The 2 horses continued without hesitation. "Hear it?" Halt asked. Will craned his head too. He thought that, just maybe, he could hear soft hoofbeats behind them, but he wasn't sure. The gait of their own horses masked any real sound from the trail behind. If there was someone there, his horse was moving in step with their own. "Change gait," Halt whispered. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Simultaneously, they both nudged their left toes into their horses' shoulders. It was just one of the many signals to which Tug and Abelard were trained to respond. Instantly, both horses hesitated in their stride. They seemed to skip a pace, then continue in their even gait. But the hesitation had changed the pattern of their hoofbeats, and for an instant, Will could hear another set of horses' hooves behind them, like a slightly delayed echo. Then the other horse changed gait as well to match their own, and the sound was gone. Ranger horse, Halt said softly. It'll be Gillen, for sure. How can you tell? Will asked. Only a ranger horse could change his pace as quickly as that. And it'll be Gillen, because it's always Gillen. He loves trying to catch me out. Why? Asked Will, and Halt looked sternly at him. Because he was my last apprentice, he explained, and for some reason, former apprentices just love to catch their former masters with their breeches down. He looked accusingly at his current apprentice. Will was about to protest that he would never behave in such a fashion after he graduated, then realized that probably he would, and at the very first opportunity. The protest died unspoken. Halt signaled for silence and scanned the trail ahead of them. Then he pointed. That's the spot there, he said. Ready? There was a large tree close to the side of the trail, with branches hanging out just above head height. Will studied it for a moment, then nodded. Tug and Abelard continued their even pacing toward the tree. As they came closer, Will kicked his feet from the stirrups and rose to stand, crouching, on Tug's back. The horse didn't vary his pace as his master shifted position. As they passed under the branches, Will reached up and seized the lowest one, swinging himself up onto it. The instant his weight left Tug's back, the little horse began to pace more vigorously, forcing his hooves into the ground with each step, so that there would be no sign to a tracker behind them that his load had suddenly lightened. Silently, Will climbed higher into the tree until he found a spot where he had a solid perch and a clear view. He could see Halt and the two horses moving slowly down the trail. As they reached the next bend, Halt urged Tug to keep going, then halted Abelard and swung down from the saddle. He dropped to his knees, seeming to study the ground for signs of tracks. Now Will could hear the other horse behind them. He looked back the way they had come, but another bend hid their follower from sight. Then the soft hoofbeats ceased. Will's mouth was dry, and his heart beat faster and faster inside his rib cage. He was sure the sound must be audible to anyone within 50 meters or so. But the training asserted itself, and he stood motionless on the tree branch among the leaves and dappled shadows, watching the trail behind them. A movement. He saw it from the corner of his eye, then it was gone. He peered closely at the spot for a second or two, then remembered Halt's lessons. Don't focus your attention on one spot. Keep a wide focus all the time and keep scanning. You'll see him as a movement, not as a figure. Remember, he's a ranger too, and he's been trained in the art of not being seen. Will widened his focus and scanned the forest behind them. Within seconds he was rewarded by another sign of movement. A branch swung back into place as an unseen figure passed silently by. Then, 10 meters farther on, a bush swayed slightly. Then he saw a clump of tall grass, springing slowly back into position from where a passing foot had crushed it momentarily. Will stayed stock still. He marveled at the fact that their pursuer could move through the forest without seeing him. Obviously, the other ranger had left his horse behind and was stalking Halt on foot. Will's eyes swiveled for a quick glance at Halt, his teacher still seeming to be preoccupied with some sign on the ground. Another movement came from the forest. The unseen ranger had passed Will's hiding place now, and was moving back toward the trail, intent on surprising Halt from behind. Suddenly, a tall figure in a gray-green cloak seemed to rise out of the ground in the middle of the trail, some 20 meters behind the kneeling figure of Halt. Will blinked. One moment the figure hadn't been there. Next, he seemed to materialize out of thin air. Will's hand began to move toward the quiver of arrows slung over his back. Then he halted the movement. Halt had told him the night before, "Wait until we're talking. If he's not talking, you hear the slightest movement you make." Will gulped, hoping that the tall figure hadn't heard the movement of his hand toward the quiver. But it seemed that he'd stopped in time. Below him, he heard a cheerful voice call out, "Halt! Halt!" Halt turned and rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees as he rose. He put his head on one side and studied the figure in the middle of the trail, who was leaning easily on a longbow identical to Halt's own. "Well, Gillen," he called, "I see you're still making that old joke." The tall ranger shrugged and replied cheerfully, "The joke appears to be on you this year, Halt." As Gillen spoke, Will's hand moved quietly but quickly to his quiver and selected an arrow, laying it ready on the bowstring. Halt was speaking again now. Really, Gillen. And what old joke would that be, I wonder? The amusement was evident in Gillen's voice as he replied to his old master. Come now, Holt, admit it. For once I've got the best of you. You know how many years I've been trying. Holt rubbed one hand over his grizzled beard thoughtfully. It beats me why you keep on trying, Gillen, as a matter of fact. Gillen laughed. You should know how much pleasure it gives an ex-apprentice to get the better of his master, Holt. Now come on, admit it. This year I've won. As the tall figure spoke, Will carefully drew back the arrow, sighting on a tree trunk some 2 meters to Gillen's left. Holt's instructions echoed in his ears. Choose a target close enough to startle him when you shoot, but for pity's sake, not too close. If he moves, I don't want you putting an arrow through him. Holt hadn't moved from his position in the center of the trail. Gillen was now shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to another. Holt's unperturbed manner was beginning to bother him. It appeared that, all of a sudden, he wasn't totally sure that Holt was merely trying to bluff his way out of the trap. Holt's next words added to his suspicions. Ah, yes. Apprentices and masters. They're a strange combination, all right. But tell me, Gillen, my old apprentice, aren't you forgetting something this year? Perhaps it was the way Holt laid a little extra stress on the word apprentice, but suddenly Gillen became aware that he had made a mistake. His head began to turn, searching for the apprentice that he'd forgotten. As he began the movement, Will released his arrow. The shaft hissed through the air past the tall ranger and thudded, quivering, into a tree that Will had selected. Gillen jerked back with shock. Then his eyes swung into the branches of the tree where Will stood concealed. Will marveled that, even caught by surprise as he was, Gillen was still able to react so quickly in identifying the direction from which his attacker had shot. Gillen shook his head ruefully. His keen eyes could make out the small gray and green-clad figure concealed in the shadows of the tree's foliage. Come down, Will, Holt called, and meet Gillen, one of our more careless rangers. He shook his head at Gillen. I told you when you were a boy, didn't I? Never be too hasty. Don't rush into things. Gillen nodded, somewhat crestfallen. He looked even more so when Will dropped to the ground from the lowest branch, and the tall ranger saw how small and young the apprentice was. It appears, he said, that I was so intent on catching myself an old gray fox that I overlooked the small monkey hiding in the trees. He grinned by his own mistake. Monkey, is it? Holt said gruffly. I'd say he's made a monkey out of you today. Will, this is Gillen, my former apprentice, and now ranger of Merrick Fife, although what they did to deserve him is beyond me. Gillen's grin widened as he held out his hand to Will. And I was just thinking I'd finally got the better of you, Holt, he said cheerfully. So you're Will? He continued, shaking hands firmly. I'm pleased to meet you. What a nice piece of work, young fellow. Will grinned at Holt, and the older ranger made a slight meaningful movement of his head. Will remembered the final instructions that Holt had given him the night before. Once you best a man, never gloat. Be generous and find something in his actions to praise. He won't enjoy being bested, but he'll make a good face of it. Show him you appreciate it. Praise can win you a friend. Gloating will only ever make enemies. Yes, I'm Will, he said. Then he added, Could you perhaps teach me how you move like that? It was brilliant. Gillen laughed ruefully. Not too brilliant, I think. You obviously saw me coming from a long way away. Will shook his head, remembering how hard he'd tried to spot Gillen. Now that he thought of it, his praise and his request were more genuine than he'd realized. I saw you when you arrived, he said, and I saw where you'd been, but I never once saw you from the time you rounded that bend. I wish I could move like that. Gillen's face showed his pleasure at Will's obvious sincerity. Well, Holt, he said, I see this young fellow doesn't merely have talent. He has excellent manners as well. Holt regarded the two of them, his current apprentice and his former student. He nodded to Will, approving his tactful words. Unseen movement was always Gillen's best skill, he said. You'd do well if he agreed to tutor you. He moved toward his ex-apprentice and placed his arm around the taller man's shoulders. It's good to see you again. They embraced each other warmly. Then Halt held out the other man at arm's length, studying him carefully. "You get lankier every year," he said finally. "When are you going to put some meat on those bones?" Gillen smiled. It was obviously an old joke between them. "You appear to have enough for both of us," he said. He poked Halt in the ribs, none too gently. "Is that the beginnings of a pot-belly I see there?" He grinned at Will. "I'll wager he's sitting around the cabin letting you do all the housework these days." Before Halt or Will could reply, he turned away and let out a whistle. A few seconds later, his horse trotted around the bend to the road. As the tall young ranger moved toward his horse and mounted, Will noticed a sword hanging in a scabbard from his saddle. He turned to Halt, puzzled. "I thought we weren't allowed to have swords," he said quietly. Halt frowned for a moment, not understanding, then followed Will's gaze and realized what had prompted the question. "It's not that we're not allowed," he explained, as they both mounted. "It's a matter of priorities. It takes years to become a good swordsman, and we don't have the time. We have other skills to develop." He saw the next question forming on Will's lips and went on. "Gillen's father is a knight, so Gillen had already been training with a sword for some years before he joined the Rangers. He was considered a special case, and he was allowed to continue that training when he was apprenticed to me." "But I thought," Will began, and then hesitated. Gillen was trotting his horse toward them, and he wasn't sure if it would be polite to ask his next question in front of him. "Never say that in front of Holt," Gillen said, overhearing Will's last words. "He'll simply reply, 'You're an apprentice, you're not ready to think,' or, 'If you had thought about it, you wouldn't ask.'" Will had to smile. Halt had used those exact words to him on more than one occasion, and Gillen's impersonation of the older ranger was uncanny. Now, however, both men were looking expectantly at him, waiting to hear the question he was about to ask, so he plunged ahead. "If Gillen's father was a knight, wasn't he automatically eligible for battle school? Or did they think he was too small as well?" Halt and Gillen exchanged a look. Halt raised one eyebrow, then gestured for Gillen to reply. "I could have gone to battle school," he said, "but I chose to join the Rangers." "Some of us do, you know," Halt put in mildly. Will thought this over. He had always assumed that the Rangers did not come from the ranks of the kingdom's nobles. Apparently he was wrong. "But I thought," he began, then instantly realized his mistake. Halt and Gillen looked at him, then each looked at each other, and said in a chorus, "You're an apprentice. You're not ready to think." Then they wheeled their horses and trotted off. Will hurriedly retrieved Tug and cantered after them. As he caught up, the two rangers edged their horses to either side, allowing him space to ride between them. Gillen grinned once at him. Halt was as grim as ever. But as they continued in a companionable silence, Will became aware of the comforting realization that he was now part of an exclusive, tightly knit group. It was a warm sense of belonging, as if, somehow, he had arrived home for the first time in his life.